Great white sharks are big, obviously. But a few years ago, divers met up with Deep Blue, probably the biggest great white shark ever caught on camera. So what do we know about the massive great white? Of course, it's impossible to hear the words great white without also hearing the Jaws theme, or that song Once Bitten Twice Shy by 80s hair metal band Great White. Definitely one of the two, no? Here, we're talking about the razor-toothed sea beast whose dorsal fin spells certain doom in Steven Spielberg movies, the great white shark. According to National Geographic, great whites are the world's biggest predatory fish, equipped with up to 300 flesh-rending teeth and a super strong sense of smell. You could call these creatures the lions of the sea, but they eat sea lions for breakfast. Even though they account for 1/3 to 1/2 of the more than 100 shark attacks that happen each year, great whites usually only bite people out of curiosity rather than bloodlust. Isn't that reassuring?
And we're gonna find a way to get out of here. First, we're gonna seal off this movie.
Well, at least in reality, very few white shark attacks are fatal. Now, this here is just your average great white shark. They tend to be about 15 feet long. But what we're here to talk about today is the greatest white shark ever caught on film. And here she comes. People call her Deep Blue, as she was first introduced to the public through Discovery Channel's Shark Week Marathon. The largest ever caught on film is about 20 feet long and weighs an estimated 5,000 pounds. Despite her gigantic size, the sharp teeth in her mouth, and those freakishly beady eyes, Deep Blue isn't a nightmare. In fact, most great whites aren't. Deep Blue is about 50 years old. When she was first discovered near the Mexican island of Guadalupe in 2013, one diver felt so comfortable that he reached out and touched her. That someone was sharkologist Mauricio Hoyos Padilla, who gave Deep Blue her nickname. In a video clip of their encounter first released in 2015, a fearless Padilla basically high-fived one of Deep Blue's fins. Because who needs both their hands? Even if you're okay with the prospect of underwater amputation, high-fiving a great white is a terrible idea because it can also endanger the shark. When a group of divers touched a different great white from inside a cage in 2016, one biologist called it, quote, one of the dumbest and most dangerous shark interactions I've ever seen. That's because in addition to endangering the divers, it could have prompted the shark to ram the cage and injure itself. In fairness to Padilla, he might have just been overcome with excitement. It's not every day that you get to see a female great white up close, as one shark expert explained to NBC.
Females are kind of elusive. We haven't really figured out where the females go and where they spend their time.
However, Padilla had some idea what Deep Blue was getting up to. He suspected the gargantuan fish was pregnant. So maybe the high five was his way of saying congrats? But maybe she's not quite as large as people say. Shark expert George Burgess, who directs the Florida Natural History Museum's International Shark Attack File, estimated the Deep Blue is closer to 18 or 19 feet long. That might seem nitpicky when you're discussing an animal that can bite off your feet altogether, but it makes a huge difference when measuring the largest animal of its kind. Deep Blue should settle things by agreeing to be tape measured. No? No? No!
The fiery disintegration of Columbia ultimately led to the loss of lives and the retirement of NASA's shuttle fleet. But as it turns out, there's more to the story that makes it so much worse, because it didn't need to happen in the first place. Columbia's 28th trip into space had been delayed for 2 full years due to various issues, but when it finally lifted off on January 16, 2003, it took just 81 seconds for disaster to strike. That's when a piece of foam from the external fuel tank came off and damaged the shuttle's left wing. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the foam chunk was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, and it hit the wing's heat-resistant panels at a relative speed of roughly 500 miles per hour. However, nobody at the time noticed. It wasn't until the following day that the foam strike was seen during a review of the launch. Foam striking the orbiter during liftoff had actually been a concern since even before the shuttle first flew in 1981. Following the first flight, over 300 heat-resistant panels had to be replaced due to damage from debris, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Most shuttle launches also had foam impacts. But the damage to the Columbia was different. Rather than hitting the more fragile white or black tiles, the foam struck the reinforced gray carbon tiles on the leading edge of the wing, which were thought to be more or less indestructible. So conventional wisdom said that a foam strike to those tiles couldn't possibly cause significant damage to the shuttle, an assumption that turned out to be deadly. A day after the launch, the foam strike was detected by NASA's Intercenter Photo Working Group. Immediately concerned that severe damage could have been done to the heat-resistant tiles there, Bob Page, the group's chair, quickly went to another official and asked him to contact the Department of Defense to obtain images of Columbia. 3 days later, a debris assessment team convened, and 2 members of that group also reportedly requested imaging of the left wing, believing the images would be crucial to assessing the damage. But they never got the images. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, NASA official Linda Ham blocked all 3 imaging requests, concluding that imaging wasn't required and that it would therefore waste too much time.
So the intent is to pack each minute of the 24 hours that we're on orbit with science.
For her part, Ham would later claim to have no knowledge of the DAT's concerns. Whatever the case, though, the debris assessment team was left flying blind, and they weren't the only ones. Without images of Columbia's left wing, the debris assessment team had to rely on computer simulators to guess what might happen on re-entry. Their conclusion, the shuttle would suffer at least some heat damage on re-entry. They just didn't know how much. In the meantime, a week after launch, NASA finally clued the flight crew in to the fact that their shuttle was damaged. But they told crew commander Rick Husband and pilot William McCool that there was, quote, no concern. NASA told them they were only being informed of the foam strike so they wouldn't be taken by surprise if reporters asked them about it when they got back. On the morning of February 1, 2003, after 16 days in space, Columbia attempted re-entry. As detailed by the Columbia Accident Investigation Report, as the shuttle was streaking over California at 8:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, witnesses reported seeing several flashes of light. A minute later, 4 sensors in the shuttle's damaged left wing mysteriously went offline. Columbia shed a heat-resistant tile as it crossed from New Mexico into Texas at 8:58, and a final unintelligible communique came from the orbiter a minute later. According to ABC News, a report released by NASA in 2008 indicated that the first alarm to sound inside the shuttle would have come only 4 seconds before Columbia spun out of control. However, either Rick Husband or William McCool remained conscious for an additional 26 seconds, desperately attempting to save the crew. At 9 a.m., observers on the ground could see that Columbia was in pieces, and all 7 astronauts on board had been killed. NASA immediately launched an investigation, with the government mobilizing a massive effort to collect as much of the debris from the shuttle as possible to determine exactly what happened. While some unscrupulous people tried to profit off the tragedy by selling debris, most people turned over anything they found. By March, recovery efforts were centered on East Texas, where hundreds of pieces of the Columbia had been found. And then, unthinkably, tragedy struck again. While searching for debris on the afternoon of March 27th, a helicopter carrying 5 people suffered an engine failure near the Angelina National Forest in San Augustine County, Texas. Though 3 passengers survived, pilot Jules Francis Buzz Meyer and Texas Forest Service aviation specialist Charles Crinick were killed instantly. Crinick was awarded the Star of Texas in 2004, and a monument to the Columbia crew in Hemp Hill, Texas also includes a pillar inscribed with Meyer and Crinick's names. In the aftermath of the incident, investigators inevitably asked the million-dollar question: would it have been possible to save Columbia's crew? According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the answer was yes, if the damage to the left wing had been detected by either spacewalk or the requested imaging.
We availed ourselves of photographic techniques which were not used because it was not assessed as being so critical.
How? Well, the Space Shuttle Atlantis was already being prepared for its next launch. Originally scheduled to launch on March 1st, the launch could have been accomplished safely as early as February 10th. According to calculations, the Columbia crew had enough supplies to remain in orbit until February 15th, meaning the Atlantis could have flown a rescue mission. Once the 2 shuttles met, Columbia's crew could have spacewalked over to Atlantis for a safe return home. For the rescue scenario to have been possible, though, the damage to Columbia's left wing would have had to have been discovered by the 7th day of the mission, which it could have been if those requests for imaging hadn't been denied.
A flushing toilet hooked up to a fresh water supply and a stable sewage line is something many people in the modern world take for granted. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 2.3 billion people don't have access to the basic sanitation afforded by modern plumbing. But all those people still turn food into waste, and that waste still has to go somewhere. Unfortunately, without plumbing, it ends up going pretty much everywhere you don't want it to go, including into soil or into bodies of water, sometimes causing the rapid spread of nasty and potentially fatal diseases.
Some of the poorest, their toilet may look like this. A pit latrine.
This problem weighs on the minds of plenty of people, including some of the crusading heads of charitable foundations and some of the world's most inventive scientists, who have been trying to solve the problem of poop and make widespread sanitation possible. In the latter category, for example, there's Bill Gates. The Microsoft founder and his wife spend most of their time these days funding and facilitating projects via the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Since 2011, the foundation says it's invested $200 million and pledged another $200 million to make the toilet issue in the developing world a little less, well, crappy. On November 6, 2018, Bill Gates spoke at the Reinvented Toilet Expo in Beijing, China. A place for inventors and organizations showed off cutting-edge bacteria-killing, literally life-saving bathroom technology.
I want to talk to you today about toilets.
Gates really wanted to drive home his message about how dangerous a problem poor sanitation can be, and so during his speech, he held up a jar of human feces to demonstrate how many toxic bacteria are present in even a small amount of human waste.
Oh, meat poop. It's showtime.
And that stuff doesn't just contain bacteria, but also
And 100,000 parasitic worm eggs, which you've got a little animation to make you think even more about that.
But the real stars of the Reinvented Toilet Expo were the 20 toilets of the future on display. And these designs really are something special, as they specifically don't need a connection to water or sewage lines. In other words, they can be used anywhere and everywhere, especially in communities that don't have plumbing infrastructure in place. Gates is a fan, placing this new category of Johns among, quote, the most significant advances in sanitation in nearly 200 years. One of the most notable loos at the Reinvented Toilet Expo, the suitably scientifically named nanomembrane toilet. Here's how it works. After a person does their business, they close the lid. That sets a series of gears into motion, which flush waste away into a holding tank at the bottom of the toilet, but without needing any water or electricity. As the mechanism rids the toilet of waste, a thin blade scrapes the bowl clean. A spiral device elevates only the solid parts of the waste out of the holding tank, cutting it into small pellets and then feeding it into a tiny combustion chamber. That's where the poop gets burned, and all the bacteria and eggs and whatever other nasties it holds die a fiery death. The user has to clean out the ashtray once a week, but what happens to your number one?
Evacuation complete.
The liquid waste passes into a channel full of membrane bundles that treat and sanitize before sending it into a holding area at the front of the toilet. It can be used for watering crops or maybe for bathing livestock, even though it's not drinkable.
Don't do that.
The nanomembrane is currently being tested in Ghana, where organizers aim to get people used to it in public restrooms. Then, over time, they hope the manufacturing costs will drop enough to allow for widespread household use. Goodbye disease, and goodbye dingleberries.
She's a dingleberry! Yeah!
The story of the Radium girls is one of the most horrifying in recent history, yet it has been nearly forgotten today. What started as a fairly good job for a group of poor women, though, soon turned into a nightmare. This is the messed up truth about the Radium girls. Radium was discovered in 1898, and it didn't take long for entrepreneurs to see the potential value in its luminescent properties. A few years after it was discovered, William J. Hammer mixed it with zinc sulfide and created a paint. While he didn't patent the invention, Tiffany & Company did. The new paint was wildly popular in Europe first, and the people who worked with it would glow as they walked through the streets at night. It wasn't until 1914 that radium-based luminescent paint started to be produced in the United States. By 1921, the main manufacturer had already expanded a few times and moved, changing their name to the United States Radium Corporation and patenting the name Undark for their paint. Other companies started popping up as well, using names like Luna and Marvlite for their paints. They weren't just making paints, they were using those paints too. US Radium hired scores of girls and young women, some as young as just 11 years old, to paint watch dials with the glow-in-the-dark radium-based paint. To make sure the dials got a good coating, the girls were encouraged to put the paintbrush between their lips and twirl it into a point. It was the best way to truly get precise numbers and brush strokes, but with each lick of the brush, they were swallowing radium, which we now know is radioactive. It wasn't long before US Radium was even getting military contracts to paint watches and instrument panels, and that meant more work for the girls. Unfortunately, that also meant more exposure to radium. The workers had been assured that the paint was harmless, so they often played games with the paint. It was common for the girls to paint their fingernails and teeth in order to enjoy the glow-in-the-dark properties.
Paint our faces up and put mustaches, and a couple of girls painted their ears.
Years later, Harvard physiologist Cecil Drinker did a study to see just how much radium the girls were actually covered in. He discovered that workers would be so covered with the paint and radium dust used everywhere in the plant that they would completely glow, and all along they were assured it was safe. It's worth noting that this wasn't just a case of a corrupt company telling their employees their working conditions were safe, at least not at first. Radium was thought to be super healthy. In fact, it was often marketed as a cure-all. The radium craze started in earnest in 1904 when L.D. Gardner began marketing a radium-infused health water he called Liquid Sunshine. Belief in radium's healthy benefits was rooted in a massive misstep in logic. Early experiments using radium to kill cancer cells had been a success. If it could kill cancer, the assumption was that it could kill whatever else was ailing you. Real doctors started experimenting with it as a cure for things like tuberculosis and lupus, while quacks started marketing their own so-called cures for everything from acne and baldness to impotence and insanity. People drank radium water and brushed their teeth with radium toothpaste, and radium cosmetics were all the rage. Children played with toys painted with radium, and performers on the New York stage danced and twirled in costumes that glowed. Radium was in such high demand that prices soared. By 1915, a single gram cost what would be around $1.9 million in today's money. Luckily for consumers, that meant many of the products didn't contain real radium. The Radium girls weren't so lucky though. Very slowly, the workers began getting sick. Some started suffering from chronic exhaustion. For many, it started with their teeth. One by one, those teeth would start to decay and rot. When they were removed, their gums wouldn't heal. In some cases, the jaw would simply disintegrate at the dentist's touch. Bad breath was common. Skin became so delicate that the slightest touch would tear open wounds. Ulcers formed for some, and those that were pregnant bore stillborn babies. It was a variety of symptoms, and when the girls started looking for recompense, that became a huge problem. Attorneys for US Radium argued that with all of these different ailments, they couldn't possibly have the same underlying cause. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell just how many dial painters there were and how many died terrible, painful deaths. Of those we know about, many dial painters were typically in their 20s when they became really and truly ill. They were young women like Margaret Looney, who grew so weak her fiancé would pull her around in a wagon.
And when she got so bad and pulled her up to where we used to have the picnic, she couldn't walk, so he just put her in the wagon, away we went.
Bones crumbled, limbs were amputated, spines were crushed under their own weight. The girls became anemic, bedridden, unable to eat. The pain was constant, and in the late 1930s, enough were dead or dying that they got national attention. US Radium first tried to blame the girls' illness on an outbreak of syphilis, and it was years before the girls got their day in court. By that time, many testified from the same beds they would eventually die in, and they became known as the Society of the Living Dead. Companies didn't just try to blame the terrible illnesses on other causes, they absolutely took an active role in trying to cover up the truth. Margaret Looney was one of a family of 10 and would cover herself and her siblings with the radium paint. It took about 6 years for her to reach the end, and when she did finally collapse, she was at work when it happened. She was taken to a company hospital and her family was told she had been quarantined for diphtheria. She died in the hospital at just 24 years old. Her death was swept under the carpet, and it would come out later that doctors had been hired to find out what was wrong with the painters as early as 1925. Those doctors had assured Looney and her co-workers that they were perfectly healthy, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The lawsuit started in the mid-1920s, but it was shockingly difficult to even find an attorney to take the girls' case. Why? When radium painters sued US Radium in 1927, they were told they had passed the 2-year statute of limitations for complaints. They didn't testify until 1928, and months of delays prompted the newspapers to pick up the story. Those women accepted an out-of-court settlement, and when Ottawa-based painters from the Radium Dial Company tried to sue in 1935, they ran into the same problems. They, however, refused to settle. It was another 2 years before their case was heard in court, and by then Catherine Wolfe Donahue, one of the lead plaintiffs, had already collapsed at a previous hearing. She gave her testimony from her sickbed, and photos were plastered all over the country's newspapers. They won their case, but it was a hollow victory. The girls were often saddled with massive medical bills, and by the time medical bills and legal fees were paid, the Radium girls got next to nothing for their pain and suffering. Even those that won an annual stipend didn't get much since they didn't live long enough to collect. There was another byproduct of the trial. The girls who were part of the so-called Society of the Living Dead weren't aided by their community. They were shunned. Writer and historian Kate Moore says that in spite of the fact that these were young mothers, wives, and girls who were dying, the communities they lived in just didn't want to acknowledge what was happening to them. After talking to locals and reading countless documents, she found that it was an overwhelming belief that they just needed to be quiet about the whole thing. Why? The jobs paid very well at a time when work was scarce. It was the Great Depression after all, and locals were afraid that if the Radium girls won their case, that work would go away. Not all of the Radium girls died young, but those who did survive struggled with predictably awful health issues. Take May Keene, who died in 2014 at the admirable age of 107. She was hired on as a dial painter in 1924. Fortunately for her, though, she didn't like it. When she was taught how to point the brush with her lips, she was revolted by the taste of the Radium paint. Keene said she only worked there for a few days when she was called into the office and asked if she would like to quit. She said yes. However, over the course of her life, she suffered from chronic health problems, including ones that sound eerily similar to those suffered by the girls who died: bad teeth and migraines, and 2 diagnoses of cancer. As it turns out, dying women and some guilty verdicts couldn't stop the Radium paint industry. Catherine Donahue weighed less than 60 pounds when she died before Radium Dial finished appealing their case before the Supreme Court. In 1934, their president, Joseph Kelly, was kicked out of the company, but Radium Dial wouldn't be the last company he opened. After Radium Dial went out of business, Kelly simply moved to a building down the road and reopened as Luminous Processes. He hired a workforce from among the girls who had been put out of work when Radium Dial closed, and he kept them painting for a long time. It wasn't until 1976 that Luminous was fined by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That commission found that Luminous had been exposing their workers to radiation levels 1,666 times higher than regulations allowed. Assets were shuffled, Luminous closed, and the lawsuits that continued into the 1980s went largely unpaid. The Radium girls weren't just sick, they were very literally radioactive. Molly McGee was exhumed in 1927 in the hopes that her bones would give still-living Radium girls the evidence they needed to win in court. Reportedly, when her coffin was lifted out of the ground, her body actually glowed. That wasn't entirely surprising, considering her bones were found to be highly radioactive. Ottawa, Illinois was known as Death City throughout the 1930s. In 1987, the documentary Radium City tried to show just how long-lasting the effects were, in a very graphic way. When one man headed into the Catholic cemetery where many of the Radium girls were buried, the Geiger counter he carried goes nuts. Their remains, 6 feet down, are still radioactive. With some of the girls, precautions were even taken. Margaret Looney and Catherine Donahue were buried in lead-lined coffins. And yes, devotees of radium-based health products are just as radioactive. Industrialist and golfer Eben Byers was the poster child for a drink called Radiothor, and drank several bottles of it a day. Holes formed in his skull, his jaw fell off, and his bones began to crumble. He died in 1932 and was so radioactive that he was also buried in a lead-lined coffin. If you think the legacy of the Radium girls ended when the companies using radium-based paint closed, you'd be sorely mistaken. After Radium Dial closed, the building was converted into a meatpacking plant. After the meatpacking plant closed, it became a farmer's co-op, and it was finally torn down in 1968. The rubble was used as fill around the city of Ottawa. The building that housed Luminous didn't fare much better. For years after the plant closed, it was also used for storing meat. Eventually, 16 separate sites around Ottawa would become classified as Superfund sites, requiring long-term intensive hazardous waste removal. NPR Illinois says that many have been cleaned up, but as of 2018, there was at least one site that still remained a highly radioactive and terrifying legacy of the Radium girls. Though death is a fundamental part of life, it's something that modern society has mostly kept out of sight and out of mind. People pass away and are passed along. They're covered in sheets and kept out of sight until morticians beautify them for their final public reveal. Then the casket is closed, and that enclosure is literally stuffed into the ground and left impossible to access. Because of our increasing distance from the reality of death, though, people are left with plenty of curiosity, discussions, and speculation about what happens to the body after death. Does the body putrefy into a mass of watery substances, or does it desiccate like a mummy? What about mausoleums, or types of coffin wood, or a steel vault, or methods of embalming? Do the deceased's health and age factors matter? Could you transform into a bog person like Tallinn Man in Denmark if only you sink into a peat bog at the moment of death? Could your body in fact absorb some crazy fungus and become an honest-to-goodness antagonist of the living in the zombie apocalypse? The possibilities are enough to keep anyone up at night.
I mean, 1 minute you're in bed with a knockout gal or guy, and the next you're a compost heap. Well, doesn't that bother any of you? Because it scares the living piss out of me.
Well, we're here to put your mind at ease by removing the doubt and telling you exactly what terrible things are going to happen to your corpse once you inevitably die. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the state of a body. Certain biological facts, though, let us create a glass window in the lid of a casket to see what would happen to your body after 10 years, excluding certain exceptions like mummification, which involves removing the organs, and barring environmental factors. A wet environment will hasten decay, and a dry environment will slow decay, for example. The first thing to know is that the most dramatic decay happens within the first month, so the difference between a body at a month after death and 10 years isn't actually all that much. For bodies that aren't cremated, there's a specific pattern of events that typically happens in the United States. First, the recently deceased pass along to autopsy techs, who may or may not extract all of a person's organs. After this, a sutured body is passed along to an embalmer, who undoes the stitches, replaces the organs, and injects a mixture of embalming fluid called cavity fluid into various vessels. A sealant is placed over the sutures to prevent leakage, and sometimes plastic and powder are placed over the body as well. This is all before the mortician applies makeup, trims nails, and dresses the dead for burial. During this entire time, the body is undergoing decay that influences what it looks like 10 years down the line. Within 3 days after death, in fact, the body undergoes autolysis, when bodily enzymes eat their own cells. Blood pools in parts of the body closest to the ground. Rigor mortis occurs and skin gets loose. And the abdomen? Generally, it turns lime green. After initial autolysis, the body bloats, exudes foul-smelling gases, and releases fluid from the mouth and nose, which, according to National Geographic, may be the inspiration for ancient vampire myths. This occurs 3 to 5 days after death, and explains why wakes are typically held right away. Then the decay begins to slow down. From 8 days on, skin recedes from fingernails, bodies start to look less human and more like decaying corpses, and flesh begins to decompose, with cartilage, bones, and hair staying intact much longer than muscles and organs. With no coffin or embalming, a body in the ground in nature takes 8 to 10 years to totally decompose. If there is a coffin or embalming, the timeline is prolonged. Decay sets in sooner in a wooden casket rather than a metal casket, but sealing a casket can help keep out moisture and bacteria. On the other hand, this can cause caskets to pressurize as decomposing bodies release gas. According to Trusted Caskets, wooden caskets can distort in shape and even explode underground. As you can imagine, this definitely won't help preserve the body, unless it somehow launches the corpse straight into the afterlife. Coffins, just like people, eventually decay and return to the soil. Long before then, though, the bodies inside them will largely be gone. Ultimately, from 1 month on, we all more or less liquefy at a similar rate. Within 10 years, teeth, bones, and maybe skin or sinew are all that are left. You know what they say, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Fossils give us a glimpse into the past. And while most fossils have been explained by now, a few remain scientific enigmas. Do they come from a lost race of giants? Outer space? Or do we still have just no clue about our own weird world? Here are a few mysterious fossils science still can't explain. The Martian bacterial fossil. Countless science fiction stories revolve around life on Mars, and more than a few pseudoscientists have found proof of life in odd Martian rock formations and camera glitches. But scientists take possible life on Mars seriously, and actually might have proof in the mysterious meteorite known as ALH 84001, which fell to Earth in 1984. Scientists determined that the meteor was from Mars and was 4.1 billion years old. Shockingly, it seemed to contain fossilized bacteria, and since its arrival, scientists have debated about its true nature. While it looks like there's bacteria embedded in it, further study has been inconclusive. Even after 30 years of analysis, scientists aren't sure if they're seeing remnants of mineral structures or a fluke geologic formation. Most exciting is the idea that planets could be constantly trading rocks through this mechanism, and maybe even trading life as well. You would think that a claim of alien life would get shut down pretty quickly, but the exact nature of this little meteor is still debated. The news was big enough to warrant an announcement from then-President Bill Clinton.
If this discovery is confirmed, it will surely be one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has ever uncovered.
And the possibilities are endless. Jurassic Park was cool, but Martian Park would be 10 times cooler. Tully Monster. Discovered in 1955 by collector Francis Tully, the first Tully monster fossil completely defied explanation. Paleontologists eagerly attempted to place the fossil within known classifications, but nobody could figure out what the monster was actually related to. The main part of the creature had a body like a cuttlefish and had no bones, but could keep a rigid shape like a mollusk or worm. iPods stuck out from the sides of his body, and most terrifying, the Tully monster's proboscis ended in a set of jaws with teeth. Adding it all up, the Tully monster looks like a drawing of a squid after a few too many beers. Because many of these fossils were eventually discovered, some samples appeared to show a rudimentary spinal cord, letting researchers know they could at least classify it as a vertebrate, closely related to the lamprey. Aside from that, the Tully monster still remains a baffling evolutionary turn. Researchers are still trying to decide how it evolved, what place it held in the prehistoric ecosystem, and whether or not they'd want to meet it in a dark alley. Arctic dinosaurs. When we imagine dinosaurs, we usually picture them in warm tropical climates. But recently, scientists have discovered a new species of dinosaur living in the most unlikely of places, Arctic Alaska. These duck-billed dinos lived 70 million years ago in the frozen north and have created countless questions, forcing paleontologists to completely rethink what they believe about dinosaurs. Reptiles living in ice-cold climates isn't really a thing, so they've totally changed the idea that dinosaurs were only cold-blooded. Most likely, their blood systems were much more diverse than originally thought. The biggest mystery is how these frigid dinosaurs made it up there in the first place, so far removed from the biggest populations of their scaly cousins. With the mystery of their migration, blood chemistry, and the other gnawing question of what exactly they ate in the frozen tundra, Alaska is rapidly becoming the last frontier of paleontology. Godzillas. In 2012, just outside Covington, Kentucky, a group of amateur paleontologists dug up one of the weirdest fossils in recent history. Oblong in shape, the fossil is around 7 feet long and consists of multiple lobes organized in an elliptical shape, like a flattened cactus, which is not exactly what you think of when you hear the name Godzillas. Research has dated the fossil to 450 million years ago, a time when life on Earth thrived in the water. So some assume that Godzillas is some sort of strange sea monster, especially because the fossil structure is unlike anything paleontologists have seen before. Most oddly, nobody's sure if Godzillas was a plant or an animal. Ron Fine, who discovered the fossil, theorized that it's a soft-bodied animal, which means 450 million years ago, there were blobby slug-like animals larger than people wandering our oceans. Others believe it's merely a mat of algae, which sounds far more plausible, but also way less fun. The Nevada Giants. The Paiute Indians in Nevada tell stories of a race of red-haired giants that lived for thousands of years before the Paiutes settled the land. Other Indian tribes in the United States tell a similar story. According to the Paiute, the tribes unified to defeat the Ginger Giants and finally kicked them out of their homeland after a protracted war. Settlers to the west did not originally believe the Indian stories, but that changed in 1911 when miners discovered Lovelock Cave. The cave was huge, and it was previously inhabited. When they began digging through the many feet of bat guano, they discovered hundreds of ancient artifacts, along with huge humanoid bones, most of which were destroyed. The site garnered intense interest, and soon amateur archaeologists and paleontologists swarmed the area, discovering more huge bones that seemingly came from 10-foot-tall giants, but may have just been bears. Digging also revealed what looked like giant fossilized handprints. The most interesting find, however, were the skulls, which featured oddly shaped jawbones and elongated features, and like everything else, were reportedly huge. The skulls are now held at a nearby museum, which maintains that there's nothing too unusual about them. They're also not on display due to Native American beliefs. Still, the idea of an epic battle between Native Americans and giants is pretty fun. If that's not a movie in the next 5 years, humanity has officially failed itself. The Impermian mass extinction. Everyone knows that the dinosaurs died from a giant asteroid collision. But few people know that the dinosaur extinction was not the only, or even the worst, mass extinction our planet has faced. There have been 5, with the largest and strangest being the Permian event, which happened 252 million years ago. Fossil records clearly show that 95% of all marine species and 75% of all terrestrial species went extinct, which is kind of impossible to imagine. The biodiversity loss on the Earth was catastrophic, and it took millions of years to get back to pre-extinction levels. And nobody knows why it happened. A leading theory about the event is that intense global warming caused the extinction, leading to wide-scale ocean acidification that was deadly to marine life. Other theories are a bit more dramatic. Geologists have discovered microscopic fractures in quartz crystals that date from the time of the extinction, implying that some sort of massive force shook the Earth. It could have been another asteroid collision. But an even more exotic theory held by many scientists is that coal in Canada and basalt in Siberia might have blown up, causing a huge ash cloud and making almost all life on Earth go extinct. We're not scientists, but we like this theory the best. Seems the most metal.
You might have tangled hair, but chances are your hair isn't literally uncombable. And in the pantheon of rare physical features, that's nothing compared to people with extra fingers and toenail-less toes. Let's look at the rarest body features a person can have. When someone's asked to swear an oath with a hand over their heart, we picture the right hand placed over the left side of the chest. For 99% of people, that's absolutely fine. That's where the heart is located. However, this isn't universally true. When the heart is located in the right side of the chest, this is called dextrocardia, and Healthline says that while no one's really sure what causes it, experts have found that it happens early on in fetal development.
I was born this way.
People with dextrocardia can live perfectly ordinary lives, though they may on occasion suffer some side effects like breathing difficulty and immune system compromise. In some cases, organ function may be impaired, causing things like jaundice and exhaustion, and may need surgical intervention to correct. Occasionally, dextrocardia exists alongside another super rare condition called situs inversus. This is when it's not just the heart that's on the wrong side of the body, but all of the organs are flipped in a sort of mirror image of what they typically are. Most of us take our fingernails and toenails for granted, but there is a rare condition called anonychia congenita, which is the absence of some or all of either sets of nails. The National Library of Medicine's Medline Plus says it's not clear just how common the condition is, just that it's unusual. Research published in Indian Dermatology Online Journal goes a step further and says that when the lack of nails occurs alone without any other abnormalities, it's extremely rare. So what's going on here? The condition results from a mutation in a gene that controls the manufacturing of a protein called R-spondin-4, and the same gene plays a role in managing body tissue and cell development. It's involved in the development of our arms and legs, and it's extremely important when it comes to the way the fingertips and toes form. Sometimes mutations in the gene block the production of certain proteins, which results in an absence of toenails or fingernails. A person can be a carrier for the gene, but it requires inheriting 2 copies of the mutated gene for the abnormality to manifest, adding to the rarity of the condition. Indian Dermatology Online Journal describes piebaldism as a rare autosomal dominant disorder of melanocyte development. You might have seen a person with piebaldism before if you know Nadine Breedy from TikTok, but what the heck does this condition mean? A person with piebaldism has patches of skin and/or hair that don't have any melanin, which is what gives color to hair and skin in normal individuals. As a result, these patches of skin or hair are lighter than other areas and are sometimes completely white. According to Medline Plus, about 90% of people who have piebaldism have a white streak of hair at the front of their scalp. It's also common to see white eyebrows and eyelashes, along with non-pigmented patches of skin on other parts of the body. There's another condition that causes a similar non-pigmentation of skin, and that's vitiligo. Vitiligo, however, develops later in life, while piebaldism is present at birth and is thought to be the result of mutations in the genes that control the development of melanin-producing cells. Given that only 1 copy of the mutated gene can cause the pigmentation, it's often passed down from parents. Fortunately, the condition does not appear to adversely affect health.
It's very difficult to brush, it's sore to brush, it's quite matted, that's the only way I can describe it.
In 2022, The Independent reported the story of Caitlin Samples, a woman from Georgia who had been sharing photos of her son on social media. It was in July of 2021 that a stranger reached out to let her know that his wild, white blonde hair was actually indicative of a rare condition called uncombable hair syndrome. It's also called spun glass hair, and that name pretty much sums it up. The condition develops in children between 3 months and 12 years old, but usually becomes less noticeable with age. It causes frizzy and dry hair that can't be combed flat, grows out from the scalp in all directions, and is usually either bright blonde or silver. According to Medline Plus, it's caused by a gene mutation that causes hair to grow in unusual shapes. While most people have hair that's cylindrical, those with uncombable hair actually have strands of hair with cross-sections that are triangular, heart-shaped, or even flat. Samples' son, Lachlan, is a very rare individual indeed. There are only 100 confirmed cases of the condition. Polydactyly, having extra fingers or toes, isn't terribly uncommon. Estimates on the prevalence of the condition vary. Imperial College London suggests that it happens in as many as 1 in 500 births, while Healthline estimates that the rate is closer to 1 in 1,000. There are different types of polydactyly, and here's where things start to get into the rare territory. The majority of polydactyl patients have surgery as children to remove the extra fingers or toes. However, some people keep their extra digits, and in some cases, the condition has become a natural part of a patient's life.
I have to buy 2 gloves, cut 1 finger from glove, put in another, so I can have a 6-finger glove.
Hypertrichosis is the name of a rare condition that results in excessive hair growth over a person's entire body. Strangely, although it's considered a genetic disorder, it's not always present at birth. Some of the 50-odd individuals diagnosed with the condition only developed it later in life in what researchers call a spontaneous mutation. According to Live Science, these can be caused by things like malnutrition and autoimmune diseases. There are several different types of hair that might start to grow, and researchers have actually traced the condition to extra genes on the X chromosome that essentially overload the body's genetic instructions for hair growth. Individuals with hypertrichosis have throughout history been exhibited in traveling freak shows. The Human Marvels tells of people like Alice Doherty, who was known as the Minnesota Woolly Girl. When she was born in 1887, she became the first known American to have the condition. Many similarly exploited individuals would share this fate in the decades that followed. When it comes to the rarity of hair and eye color combinations, there's one that's the rarest of all, being a blue-eyed redhead. Why? According to Medical Daily, this particular combination is rare for 2 reasons. First, each trait is relatively rare by itself. Red hair is found in somewhere between 1 and 2% of the population, while only about 17% have blue eyes. Both traits are also recessive, which means that a person would need to inherit the redheaded genes and the blue-eyed genes from both parents. Reader's Digest did the math and found that roughly 0.17% of the world's current residents are both redheaded and blue-eyed. It's so rare that the University of Melbourne actually did a deep dive into the possibility that the color combination was going extinct. Evolutionary biologist Mark Elger says that it's unlikely, though, as even though the genes don't always manifest because of their recessive nature, they're still being carried and passed along to future generations, as evidenced by people like TikToker Larson Thompson. Richard Gunderman, a professor of medicine at Indiana University writing for The Conversation, says that dense bones aren't unusual, but dense bones usually become brittle and easily broken in a condition called osteoporosis. Interestingly, research has isolated a few unique families that have bones that are not only dense, but also incredibly strong. The phenomenon came to the attention of the medical community when one man was in a car accident that should have left him little more than a bag of broken bones. When he walked away, though, X-rays showed that not a single bone was fractured. Further investigation revealed that his bone density was about 8 times that of a normal person, and still further study led researchers from Yale to the realization that it was a trait that had been passed down through the family. Those who had the rare feature were obvious at a glance, as they also had very square-jawed faces. Members of the family reported side effects. They were incredibly bad swimmers because they would sink, and hip replacement surgeries failed because doctors couldn't penetrate their bones. Strangely, science says that there's another family with incredibly strong bones, but theirs come coupled with curly hair and brittle teeth. It's called trichodento-osseous syndrome, is present in just a few thousand people, and it was traced back to one person, a Scottish sea captain who emigrated to the US when it was still a British territory. Is there a physical feature that allows people to get by on just a few hours of sleep every night? Yes, says Scientific American, and it's a genetic mutation on a gene named DEC2. This mutation was studied in 2009 when researchers from the University of California, San Francisco looked at a mother and daughter who both had the DEC2 mutation and who felt well rested and absolutely fine with just about 6 hours of sleep a night. With most people needing between 7 and 8 hours, that's 6 hours a night usually comes with ill effects felt after just a few days. With the genetic mutation in place, though, they were fine.
I am awake.
Sorry to burst the bubble of everyone who would absolutely love to be able to do this, but it's estimated that only about 1% of the population has a desirably abnormal DEC2. And here's the thing. According to the National Institutes of Health, it's unlikely that this single mutation tells the full story, and more contributing factors may be discovered. In 2004, National Geographic reported on a series of studies that looked at groups of people living in high-altitude environments where the oxygen is much thinner than what most people are used to. They found that each group had physically adapted to help them thrive in these inhospitable conditions. People living in the Andes Mountains of South America had developed red blood cells with the ability to carry much more oxygen per cell than normally observed, and that makes their entire circulatory system much more efficient. Meanwhile, those living in Tibet have adapted in a different way. Not only do they breathe more frequently to better oxygenate their blood, but they've evolved expanded blood vessels to better pump this oxygen-rich blood throughout their bodies. According to the National Health Service, there are 36 different blood groups and 8 main blood types. The latter consists of the familiar-sounding ones like O, A, B, and AB positives and negatives. But let's talk rare. Among this group, the rarest is AB negative. Just 1% of the population has this type of blood, though that's actually pretty widespread compared to some of the other types. The NHS says that of their 830,860 donors, Sue Olds from Cornwall is the only one with a -D- blood type. There's also a single person with KL negative and one with HY negative, but the NHS claims that it's the -D- that's super valuable, as it can be given to a wide range of recipients with no side effects. There's also what MedicineNet calls the golden blood type. It's more scientifically called the Rh-null blood group, and with fewer than 50 people in the world having it, and only 9 of those people regularly donating it, it's the rarest blood type of them all. What makes that blood type different is that there are no Rh proteins on the red blood cells, which makes them a universal donor. Though this is great, it comes with a huge problem. Anyone who has Rh-null blood can only receive a blood transfusion from another Rh-null person, and given how rare they are, it's a physical feature that could very quickly become deadly. Cremation is an increasingly popular way to dispose of a loved one's remains after death, but it's actually a more complex process than you might think. Here's what happens to a body when it's cremated. Ironically, a body's journey towards cremation begins with a trip to the refrigerator. Crematories nowadays have special rooms maintained at low temperatures. This is where the body of the deceased stays while they're not yet lined up for cremation. When it's time, the staff retrieve the remains from the refrigerated room in preparation for identification. Prior to identification, staffers give the deceased one final bath to ensure that the body is clean and well dressed, though unless the cremation will be open to the public or the family specifically asks for it, the deceased will not undergo embalming. The cremation process officially kicks off with a medical examiner properly identifying the body, typically with assistance from a relative of the deceased. The body receives a metal ID tag, which will remain there during the cremation. The family member also authorizes the cremation process. Meanwhile, it's the examiner's job to confirm that the body isn't vital in any pending investigations, as medical exams obviously won't be possible post-cremation. Depending on where the cremation is taking place, the next step in the process is usually the removal of jewelry, prosthetics, eyeglasses, medical devices, and other accessories from the body. Among the first things the technician removes are so-called cancer seeds. If the deceased was undergoing treatment for cancer while they were still alive, chances are the technician will find some radioactive isotopes implanted in their body. Prosthetics and silicone implants also don't stay on the body because they could result in some unpleasant reactions during the cremation process. Additionally, the crematory technician takes items from the body that the bereaved would like to hold on to. However, the technician doesn't remove any pins, screws, or replacement joints from the deceased. Any items that don't end up in the family's hands undergo recycling or proper disposal but are never directly reused. A notoriously dangerous item to leave on a soon-to-be cremated corpse is an artificial pacemaker. Cambridgeshire Live reports that a forgotten pacemaker can generate an explosion powerful enough to send a 40-ton crematory machine flying up to 7 inches off the ground. A paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine reveals that the first recorded incident of a pacemaker accident during a cremation took place in 1976, resulting in 5 explosions and a half-inch sized hole in the machine. While the final destination of a person's cremated remains could eventually be inside an urn or scattered across a significant location, before cremation the body is first placed in a cremation casket. According to Neptune Society, the family has the option to purchase either a traditional casket or a combustible one, with the only requirement being that the casket must be devoid of metal pieces. A combustible casket is usually the choice for families who plan to hold a religious service or make the cremation viewable to the public. As the name suggests, these metal-free coffins are made of bamboo, cloth-covered wood, hardwood, teak, wicker, plywood, pine, or any other combustible material. Even a cardboard box could suffice. When it's time, the staff wheel the casket into a machine called a cremation chamber or retort, but never an oven. Technicians preheat the incinerator to about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. During the process itself, temperatures can reach up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Designed to accommodate a single body, the chamber is lined with fire-resistant bricks that can withstand the heat beyond the hottest temperatures within. For safety reasons, technicians only open the mechanized automated doors just enough to let the body slide safely in without subjecting the room to unbearable heat. Today's cremation chambers also adhere strictly to state environmental regulations. The cremation process generates gases and particles, which is why there's a secondary chamber that sucks them in and takes them through a 30-foot labyrinth of sorts, while subjecting them to flames up to 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. By the end of the maze, most of the gases will have already been incinerated before they can even reach the atmosphere. Depending on the arrangement or the religious beliefs of the family, the bereaved may start the cremation process by pressing a button, and then science takes over. About 3/4 of the human body is water. During the cremation, all of that moisture is the first to go, and the body dries up as the heat in the chamber intensifies. The entire process is a mix of melodramatic and macabre. Body hairs burn up, skin waxes, welts, and splits as it burns. The muscles flex one last time as the scorching heat causes them to contract. The soft tissues melt into nothingness, and the skeleton? That breaks down bit by bit, calcifying and crumbling as the chamber torches the remains. Eerily, because the secondary chamber deals with the resulting gases and particles before they can make it out, the burning body typically generates no smell. This also prevents any mercury, such as from dental amalgam fillings, from escaping the chamber. In some cases, crematoriums use the heat generated by the entire process for warmth, a practical use of all that energy, considering how some can cremate up to 3,000 bodies yearly. Even with the metal tag and precautionary guidelines in place, the fear of a crematory mix-up, whether it involves the wrong body getting cremated or a family receiving the wrong ashes, is ever present. However, cremations are done separately, one body at a time, to greatly minimize the risk of any of these unfortunate events happening. Still, the unthinkable has happened on rare occasions. In 2018, for instance, a woman in Texas was supposed to be buried but was accidentally cremated instead. And in 2015, a family was sent the ashes of an unknown stranger rather than their family member. So, how long does it take to cremate a body? The answer is essentially, it depends. Various factors affect the duration of the process, such as the type and quality of the cremation equipment and chamber, as well as the nature of the cremation casket. The weight of the deceased is another important consideration. The heat inside the chamber burns fat rather quickly, yet an obese body can take longer to cremate, and in some cases can generate more gases and particles than the afterchamber can handle. It's safe to say that a typical cremation can last from 60 minutes to 3 hours, though most take between 90 and 120 minutes. The staff can check the status of the cremated body through a spy hole, but only when the chamber isn't firing off pillars of flames. Interestingly enough, the word ashes is a bit of a misnomer. Despite spending hours getting blasted by extreme heat, the body that went into the cremation chamber doesn't come out of it looking like a pile of ash. While ashes is the more commonly used term, it's more accurate to call them cremains, because that's precisely what they are. The cremated remains of bones that have turned coarse and grayish instead of powder-like. As you can imagine, the resulting cremains are piping hot, making them unsafe to handle with bare hands. Technicians use a long rod, like a farmer's rake or hoe, to gather them up, putting them in a separate container and leaving them alone until they're cool enough to inspect. By the end of the cremation process, what used to be a human body turns into less than 10 pounds worth of cremains. After some time, the technician inspects the cooled cremains for any remaining scraps of metal from dental or surgical implants. These technicians use forceps and strong magnets to make the metal elimination process easier. After stripping the cremains of metal, the metal is sent off to be recycled or disposed of following state regulations. It's important to separate the leftover metal from the cremains, as those bits can cause problems in the next part of the process. The cremains undergo one more step before the crematory prepares to send them back to the family of the deceased. It's time to pulverize the little chunks and fragments of dried bone into sand-like particles. To accomplish this, technicians use a machine called a cremulator, which is sort of a high-powered grinder or blender that quickly pulverizes the bone fragments using ball bearings or sharp rotating blades. After the deceased has been cremated, there are a number of options that the bereaved can pick to serve as their loved one's final resting place. However, this isn't an instantaneous process. According to Lincoln Heritage, it may take anywhere between a week and 10 days before the crematory finishes preparing the cremains for the family, depending on their internal policies. By far, one of the most popular options is a cremation urn. The staff places a plastic bag containing the ashes into the urn, which they then hand over to the family. The family can either purchase the urn directly from the crematory or buy from a different source. Urns don't necessarily have to look plain and undecorated, though. You can get designer urns that come in every shape possible, from an urn with a famous dictator's face on it to a Star Trek-inspired container.
The urn, it's the only place.
Sometimes families may go for more personalized or unique ways of storing cremains. Some opt to bury the urn or position it under a significant spot like a sculpture or a tree. Others place the cremains inside pendants or lockets so that they can take their dearly departed with them wherever they travel. There are even family members who opt to compress the carbon-rich cremains into cremation diamonds. For some folks, the idea of having their ashes scattered across the ocean or all over their favorite spot is the truest form of returning to nature. As romantic as it may seem in books and movies, however, it's not something your loved ones can easily do for you someday. In fact, it's illegal in quite a few places, and if your loved ones get caught, your final resting place will most likely be a landfill. Unsurprisingly, amusement parks are at the top of the list of places where it's illegal to scatter ashes. According to a 2018 article in the Wall Street Journal, a HEPA cleanup immediately follows any attempt to scatter cremains in Disney parks, which, according to employees, is apparently a monthly thing. If you and your deceased loved one were fans of Mickey Mouse, getting caught would probably be the worst thing for both of you. The cremains would end up in the trash, and you'll get kicked out of the happiest place on earth.
If you insist on disposing your loved ones in a theme park, take them over to Busch Gardens, because anything goes over there.
Other places where you can't scatter ashes: golf courses, sports stadiums, or any kind of private property. If it's any consolation, you can send your loved one's ashes into outer space, though it'll cost you between $2,500 and $12,500, a cost that not everyone wants to pay.
We're scattering the f***ing ashes, but just because we're bereaved doesn't make us sap!
As mentioned earlier, the cremation process ends up generating large quantities of gas and particles, and while the afterchamber exists to deal with this, according to CNN, it's not always enough, especially with the rising number of cremations. So it's not surprising that experts have been working to come up with a more environmentally friendly alternative. According to Popular Mechanics, alkaline hydrolysis, also called liquid cremation, started out as a means of disposing of infected animal carcasses. The operator heats up a stainless steel pressurized chamber full of water and potassium hydroxide to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 3 hours, it can turn a body into a goopy greenish-brown liquid, leaving only softened bones and non-organic matter behind. A fortuitous side effect of this process, particularly from the perspective of human cremation, is that it generates fewer pollutants, including reduced carbon monoxide. Alkaline hydrolysis seems like a fantastic alternative to modern cremation, but there are some downsides to it. For starters, it's a lot more expensive. Crematories can expect to spend up to a cool $500,000 for the chamber, which is 5 times what a basic cremation chamber costs. The process also takes longer than cremation, up to 16 hours according to the Cremation Association of North America, and for now, it's illegal in many states.
The bonds we have with our canine companions are unlike any other friendships or relationships we have. Some of us love our dogs like children, and it's no wonder. There's an unconditional friendship there that makes everything better. And knowing what's going on inside those knobby little heads can only make us understand them better. Here's what you might not realize about your furball's weirdest little habits. Let's start with the greatest mystery of our time. Why do some dogs eat poop? Horse poop, cat poop, unidentified poop, sometimes their own poop. Some dogs just love the stuff for some horrible reason. Poop eating is such a common thing that it even has a scientific name, coprophagia. There are a whole bunch of reasons why a dog might be doing it, and sometimes it's a problem. Most pups sample some poop at some point just for the heck of it. Nursing mothers will often eat the poop of their puppies to clean up after them, and some puppies will see mum doing it and think it's what they should be doing too. Puppy see, puppy do, right?
Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, alright? I learned it by watching you.
In some cases though, it might be a sign that there's some sort of behavioral issue brewing. Do they spend too much time alone? Are they just doing it to get your attention? If they get a rise out of their two-legged friends by nomming on droppings, that might be what's happening. But if your adult dog suddenly starts wolfing down poopsicles, they also might not be getting enough nutrients and decided to add turds to the menu to supplement their diets. That can happen if they're on food that's not the best quality or if they're developing some underlying condition like diabetes. So, you might want to get that checked out before your furball turns into a toilet or a fire hydrant.
Good one.
On the other hand, it's perfectly normal for even the healthiest and sanest dogs to stop, drop, and roll in crap on any given day, so don't fret if they come inside smelling like a butt when you least expect it. Now, while we're on the subject of butt smells, what's with the butt sniffing? As a mere human, you're probably baffled by what could possibly be so interesting about the smell of a dog's butt. But for canines, that rear stink is where it's at. Well, sort of. It turns out dogs aren't exactly smelling other butts, at least not in the way you think. They're actually getting a whiff of what's coming from something appropriately called the anal sac. This is the source of some chemical secretions that contain a huge amount of information about the dog, sort of like a dog's fingerprint or driver's license or Facebook account, but like in its butt. One dog can tell a ton from what's coming out of these glands, right down to their new friend's diet and current emotional state. Researchers have found that the chemical compounds are only half of the communication network, and that dogs have a super sensitive receptor in their noses called the Jacobson's organ. This particular receptor is tuned to the particular acids secreted by the anal glands and allows them to completely filter out any other scents that might get in the way of receiving this chemical communication. And it's also the same organ they use when they're sniffing around the popular pea tree at the dog park. What's even weirder about all of this is that humans have the same sort of glands that dogs do. They're just located in a different region of our bodies. And that explains why your dog introduces himself to your friends' pals by getting a few good whiffs of their crotches.
Anybody comes to visit you, the first thing that dog does is take his nose and put it right in their crotch. Woo!
It may seem a little overly friendly, but it's just their way of scoping out the situation with whoever you're bringing home.
He smells my dog!
How many words do they understand? The short answer to the question is more than you think. The long answer is a bit complicated. Researchers have found that it depends on a lot of things, from training and a dog's intelligence to the dog's breed and how they're spoken to. Right now, the record holder for the most known words is Chaser, a border collie from South Carolina, who knows over 1,000 words. Chaser's owners spend a huge amount of time teaching her not only the different names for things, but different actions. Chaser has shown the ability to join verbs and nouns together to perform particular tasks, and she can even use the process of elimination to select toys that she hadn't been taught the name of. But, don't start filling out college applications for Professor Bones a lot. Your dog's still pretty stupid by human standards. Most dogs have a vocabulary roughly equaling that of a 2-year-old. An average dog understands about 165 words and phrases. On the other hand, that's actually kind of impressive, considering only a few people can even tell the difference between an arf and a woof.
What? 4 clowns? Well, their car's broken down. They're in trouble. And that dog is not talking to you.
Right-pawed or left-pawed? Just like humans, dogs can either be right-handed or left-handed. Unlike humans, there's an equal chance of your dog being either right or left paw dominant or ambidextrous. There are a few different ways you can test to see which paws your pup prefers, and that just involves paying attention to which paw it uses to do things like give high fives and steady toys, or which side of the batter's box he plays in.
Batter up!
Humans have always had a sort of bias against the left-handed, and weirdly, researchers have found that the bias might be alive and well in dogs too. They found that left-pawed dogs tend to be more wary, or even aggressive towards strangers. Interestingly, most guide and service dogs are right-pawed or ambidextrous, as many left-pawed dogs are weeded out because of temperament.
Hey, talk to the paw.
There also seemed to be a connection between how dominant your dog's paw preference is and how brave they are. Ambidextrous doggos tended to be more anxious, while dogs with a strong preference to a dominant paw were quicker to adjust to new situations and less easily rattled.
Hey, that is the bird. I have never seen one up close, but this is the bird. May I take your bird back to camp as my prisoner?
Why do dogs tilt their heads? Make a funny noise from across the room and keep your eye on your dog's reaction.
You go. And he goes.
So, why do they do that? Well, dogs' emotional intelligence is pretty high, so they could be tilting their heads to look for that positive response they usually get from you when they do it. But there's probably even more to it than that. Depending on the shape of your dog's head, they may also be able to improve their ability to pinpoint the location of a noise if they adjust the position of their ears, clearing their line of sight at the same time. Now, studies have shown that dogs with longer muzzles tend to do this more often, so it's likely there's some kind of physical sensory benefit they're getting from it. Yet another theory suggests that they're just concentrating particularly hard, trying to read what you're communicating to them and seeing what words they recognize. They're looking and listening for social cues to figure how they're going to react and waiting to see if you're going to say something like, "Let's go for a walk," or "How about a treat?" "Yes, you are. Yes, 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 yes." In other words, if you see your doggy tilting their head, hop to it. It's probably waiting for some love and attention. Just, don't go overboard.
And now, this could be it. Oh, buddy!
We humans have done a lot on Earth, although not every other species would agree we've done all good things. Lots of animals have gone extinct since we bootstrapped ourselves into the modern age. But some of those extinct animals have actually been rediscovered years later. To many, coelacanths are the poster children of species we thought were extinct. This Darwinian darling once again graced us with its presence off the coast of South Africa in 1938, a whopping 66 million years after it was thought to have retired. The initial find made headlines worldwide, and with good reason. The coelacanth is a biological time machine, giving scientists the chance to rewind to a time before humans even existed. Its morphology includes things that may have developed into humanoid features later on, like its uniquely hinged skull, tube-like heart shape, and a nearly vacant, fat-filled brain.
This is a nice fish, Big f***ing eyes, but a nice f***ing fish.
Despite a 400 million year run, these bony fish are hanging on by a thread. There are less than 10,000 of the two species still in existence, with numbers continually dwindling. Nobody's trying to eat these chaps, but they're getting caught up in fishing nets and are at risk from climate change. The notoriously big bee goes by a number of different names. Some know it as Wallace's giant bee. Others call it Raja Ofu, meaning king of the bees in Indonesian. However, the official taxonomic classification is Megachile Pluto. Whatever you choose to call it, you're unlikely to find a specimen in the wild. Since its original discovery by Alfred Wallace in 1858, it's only been sighted a handful of times, eluding scientists until being rediscovered in 1981. Since then, the all-star species was feared extinct until two specimens popped up on eBay in 2018, one of which sold for over $9,000. Its official rediscovery came in early 2019 after a 5-day expedition discovered a single female in a termite nest. If you're ever in Indonesia or on eBay and think you've spotted one, first check to see if it's as big as your thumb. Then look for its incredibly large mandibles and listen for its buzzing, which should sound like a low-powered electric razor. If so, you may be looking at a female, which can grow up to 2.5 inches, while males only grow to about an inch and lack mandibles. The Arakan forest turtle was last seen in 1908 by a British military officer before they started showing up in Asian food markets in 1994. While this specific breed was not commercially hunted, locals had no qualms about chowing down on them as medical cures for things like infertility, weakness, poverty, or lack of happiness. There are probably better ways to find happiness than eating turtles, but animal consumption for wellness is a deeply ingrained tradition in some cultures. That said, the threat of human consumption, coupled with a mating cycle that produces just one egg per year, has put the Arakan forest turtle population at risk. Luckily, recent years have seen conservation areas mandated, slightly increasing their numbers in the wild. Even better, organizations such as the Turtle Conservancy and Zoo Atlanta have had success in hatching more, keeping the dream alive for these foot-long shell-backed amphibians. The Lord Howe stick insect, or tree lobsters as they're known colloquially, can be found in the Lord Howe Island group, about 370 miles off the eastern coast of Australia. Once used as fishing bait, the population was thought to have been eradicated when the SS Macambo ran aground in 1918, introducing voracious black rats that resulted in the extinction of many of the island's animals. The problem got worse when officials tried to address it by introducing Tasmanian masked owls, a disastrous double down on carnivorism. However, things took a surprising turn in 2001 when 24 of these surprisingly fast 5-inch bugs were rediscovered 100 feet up under a single shrub on Ball's Pyramid. Scientists were able to find 2 breeding pairs, one of which was sent to a private breeder, and the other to the Melbourne Zoo, which has since led to initial success in repopulating the species. If all goes well, plans to repopulate Lord Howe Island will be put into place once rat populations have been eradicated. The New Guinea Highland wild dog is one of the most rare and primitive canine species in the world. Ironically, the first dog of this species seen in over 50 years actually found us in 2016, following a researcher who was looking for evidence of the breed. Considered an apex predator of New Guinea, this species is known to natives as Anging Penyani, or dog that sings, and it is considered the foundational breed of what would become the rare New Guinea singing dog. These domestic canines howl with range-matching Mariah Carey, trilling and hitting notes that share sonic similarities with birds and humpback whales.
That's a bark. There we go. A little better.
The Highland wild dogs are also related to Shiba Inus, giving the species even more internet fame. The species is a variant of the gray wolf, diverging in evolution in the late Pleistocene era, and also shares DNA with Australian dingoes. Despite its proud lineage and confirmed sightings in the wild, virtually nothing else is known about the species, which is considered something of a missing link in the genetic history of canines. Imagine being so seductive that people are willing to kill just for a chance to get a piece of you. That's the sad reality of the Kashmir musk deer, whose scent glands are thought to be an aphrodisiac, so hunters kill them for their fetid love sting. As a result, the mule deer had once been thought to be extinct in some parts of the world, vanishing from Afghanistan from 1949 until being rediscovered in 2009. It's enough to make you want to hug them, but don't. Besides being endangered, they also have razor-sharp fangs like a vampire, so maybe just leave them alone. To many birdwatchers, the Australian night parrot is considered the holy grail. The bird is so seldom seen that some ornithologists have spent decades searching for it without success. This rare bird was first described in 1861 by John Gould. From 1912 to 1979, nobody could find it at all, and since then it's only been seen a handful of times, including the most recent sighting in 2017 near Lake Disappointment.
This isn't my world. Disappointed!
Speaking of disappointment, there's not much to write home about when it comes to the night parrot. It's nocturnal and is essentially just a pudgy green and brown ball that prefers to hop around on the ground rather than use its wings. If you want to see it in flight, you've got to scare it, which will cause it to make its decidedly odd startled croak before lifting off. Otherwise, it'll just putter around in tall grass, scavenging for grass seeds and herbs.